Well, you can hear me okay? Yes. All right. Well, there's no time left, so thanks for coming. And I'll be back sometime soon. Is it better if I yell or if I talk in the mic?
Yell. No difference.
No difference. Okay. All right, I'll do a little bit of both. Anyway, I'd like to thank the Mass Pike for being generous tonight and actually allowing me to get here on time. It's not always that easy. And I always know when I'm in the suburbs because there's free parking out on the road. I'm like, are you kidding me? I can park here for free? There's got to be a trick. It must be a trick. And right in front of the place, too, which is awesome. So it's great to be here. I enjoy doing talks. This book has been a great love for the last 6 months. And I've spoken to many groups in bookstores, libraries. I spoke at a bar once, which was interesting because everybody got really loaded. And every night is different. It's completely different because some of it's up to you. I can read stories from the book, and I will, but if you have any feedback, you want to let me know about some of the things you've gone to see, or you have a comment about the band I'm talking about, or you have a memory, you just raise your hand and we'll start something. So you never know. Now, if you don't want to say anything, that's cool. I brought plenty. I got a lot. So it's a lot of fun for me because I always start in the same place, but every night is completely different. This book is 50 rock and roll short stories. I call it short stories, creative writing stories. These are bands that I've seen in my life, from back in 1970 with the James Gang up to recently with Joe Walsh. So there's a cyclical thing there with Joe Walsh in James Gang and then being a solo artist. But it's been through my entire life. And it's a story of the band and them in concert, and also a story of me and what I went through, which is like you. We all have stories when we go to these shows. Great things that happen, terrible things, funny things. We become educated as to what the band is all about. We get to see how they're reacting to the audience. It's a whole educational and fun thing. So I'm learning about rock and roll in this book, and you take the journey with me. At the beginning, I'm just 16 years old, going to my first show, smelling pot for the first time and wondering, what is that? Who let the cow in here? Silly stuff like that. My second show, I saw Steppenwolf for my second show, and that was a general admission show, and whenever somebody went to get a piece of pizza, they'd pack up their seat and pass it back. So if people came back, it's like, where's my seat? And we'd all move up a little bit. I mean, you all have seen things like this. And so I had enough of these experiences after going to 3,000 shows. I thought, I should write some of this down. And started taking a little chance on a couple of stories, and pretty soon one story turned into 2, turned into 3, and I had 50 stories. And my wife likes to sleep late, so I get to get up in the morning and write, and when she gets up, I share what I'd been doing. And then off to work, Mass Pike, hello. That's how it works. So I'd like to go back to near the beginning and read you a bit from the book. I'm not reading from the book because I took the liberty of blowing everything up to 16-point font so I could see it easily. This one goes back to 1974. So I actually been living in Boston for most of my life, and I actually grew up though in Pennsylvania, and then went to college in Florida for a year, and then up to New Hampshire. And then from New Hampshire, ended up in Boston, because I love New Hampshire, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity for radio, which is what I really wanted to get into, and also writing, which I wanted to do. My dream was to come to Boston and work for the Boston Globe and write articles for them, but they had a guy named Steve Morris already working there, and I don't know if you know Steve, but he wrote music articles for the Globe for many years, and he was great, and he wasn't going anywhere. So. But that's what brought me to Boston, and it was great to come here, and I've enjoyed living here for my life. But some of these early stories are pretty funny when I was a kid, and this one is called The Call of the Wild. This is chapter 6, Ted Nugent and the Amboy Dukes. Ted Nugent, this is a show at the Valley Theater in East Greenville, Pennsylvania, which is not exactly Times Square. It's pretty quiet there, and that's kind of the funny part of the show, is that Ted Nugent is coming to this little hamlet in Pennsylvania. But the thing is, nobody actually knows who Ted Nugent is yet. This is before he became famous. So, from the book. I grew up right off Route 29, a two-lane spike through eastern Pennsylvania woodlands and miles of farmland, skirting the eastern edge of Amish country and swinging south from Allentown towards Pottstown. Not much ever goes on there other than the steady transformation of those fertile fields into acres of subdivisions. If you lived in that area and you were a farm boy, nothing hurt more than to see those grand old Pennsylvania barns fall into neglect, eventually collapsing into sumac-covered heaps of boards and slate roof tiles to be auctioned off, then bulldozed into streets lined with gleaming new mailboxes. Astride Route 29, just 7 miles from my home, sat the sleepy village of East Greenville. Here, in the quaint locale of just a couple thousand, an event would soon occur that was destined to strike the townspeople like a compact thermonuclear device, drop them a B-52 into the streets below. Even now, as the bomb plummeted, nobody at Ground Zero had any clue that a real-life version of Looney Tunes' Tasmanian Devil had been invited inside the town limits. Gonzo time had arrived. And you would say, of course, you idiot, you're talking about Ted Nugent, Motor City madman, berserk rock star, passionate outdoorsman, expert bow hunter, stout NRA lifetimer, and ultra right-wing nut. In the 70s, his frenzied guitar assaults and sophomoric songs of lust first connected in the Midwest with an army of mostly male teens, before going nationwide to hawk over 30 million albums, 6 platinum discs, and sell out 20,000 seaters like gulping venison sausages at breakfast. But this was before all that. In January 1974, no one had even heard of the guy yet. He was an unnoticed tiger prowling in our midst, a star in his own head, still shooting clay pigeons instead of the real thing. When I was home from college during January break, the local FM underground radio station started playing a song from Ted Nugent and the Amboy Dukes called Call of the Wild. The DJ announced that the group would be performing a couple of concerts at the Valley Theater in East Greenville. Really? On the strength of a couple of songs, plus a ticket price of $3. Remember those? Yeah, remember those prices. God. You could afford to make a mistake. You know, you could leave after the first song and you'd still be okay. Even in 1974. The DJ announced, okay, I did that. On the strength of a couple of songs, plus a ticket price of $3, my best friend Bob and a few high school buds agreed to go. We sufficiently prepared our minds and bodies with some beer and a bottle or two of the infamous and ghastly tasting Mad Dog 2020. Some of you know. Mogan David wine. For better or for worse, the thick, sickly, sweet Mad Dog, if it could be kept down, did wonders for eliminating teenage inhibitions. Tonight, the effect was for the better. No one had gotten the whirlies, and the 4 of us arrived at the theater in high spirits. By the way, Mad Dog in the 90s became, you know, what was that stuff? The green stuff?
Jägermeister.
Jägermeister, yeah, Jägermeister. Oof. I was at a ZLX Halloween party, and a couple of guys got me to do 4 shots with them. I remember nothing. My vision was turned green. We moseyed down to a set of seats directly in front of the chest-high stage and stared in surprise, then anticipation, at an actual buffalo head mounted behind a drum kit. No longer roaming the range, but now commanding the stage, the buffalo offered another clue as to just who this mysterious Ted Nugent was. The theater hadn't filled up with much more than 60 or 70 people before the lights went down and we stood up to welcome the feature attraction. A bass player and a drummer ambled out and settled in, kicking off a rhythm, before a flash of brown suddenly scurried into view, animal-like, from the side curtains, stepping up onto a set of guitar amplifiers and hitting a monstrous introductory chord louder than we could have ever imagined in such a tiny place. Thoughts of falling plaster and crashing walls commanded my attention as I struggled to size up the outlandish figure who then hurled himself into the air, landing cat-like and rushing forward to the lip of the stage while raking his guitar back and forth like John Dillinger spraying the cops with lead. Ted Nugent stood 5 feet away, staring into my eyes with a voracious grin. He was nearly naked, merely sporting a leather loincloth and full Indian headdress, with wild tangles of hair tumbling under the feathers and past his shoulders to drape over a big hollow body Gibson, inviting me to react or I would die. Nugent had chosen his game strategy well, proving that the best defense against an untested audience's possible apathy was an unexpected and overpowering offense. Shock and awe. Like a unit of seasoned rangers dropping out of the sky and taking out their target before any return fire, the guitarist wheeled about, headdress feathers swinging in a grand arc as he slammed out chords. It was useless to try to talk. The waves of metal blasting forth rendered even shouting inaudible. When the song ended, our quartet exploded with as loud a response as we could muster, but our wild clapping and shouts sounded meek and ineffective in the wake of that powerful opening salvo. I turned to look at the people behind us. Some stood in isolated spots joining in applause, but most just sat in their seats, eyes glassy, faces blank with shock, minds still failing to process what had just happened. If Nugent was disappointed at the half-empty house, he didn't show it, reaching up to take off the headdress and then plowing into the opening of another song. We didn't know the names of any of the songs, but it didn't matter. Nugent had a flair for making every unknown piece of music memorable, from extended episodes of howling feedback to more gimmicks like taking his axe off and beating it relentlessly with a guitar strap while it shrieked and moaned. And who could have expected that the warrior would grab a bow and arrow from his box of stage tricks, threatening us like we were pheasants scattering in a field? In a few worried seconds, the weapon had traversed the audience, then trained on a styrofoam head placed on an amplifier. Nugent let the arrow fly, and the skull split apart, plastic chunks flying all over the stage. This sure wasn't Crosby, Stills, and Nash. That's Ted Nugent. That's a bit of it. Yeah, that was just a bit of the chapter. I mean, the chapters are about 2,000 words. There was actually 2 shows that night, and they only had 60 or 70 people for the first show, and I think they probably had 30 for the second. And he actually, at the end of the show, when he finished his set and he came out before the encore, they went off for 3 seconds, came back, so he wouldn't stop clapping. He said, "Hey, we're out in the back in an RV. If anybody wants to come back and say hi, come on back." And so it's kind of cool, you know. I mean, here's a chance to meet this crazy wild man. But I don't know why we didn't do it, but I can only surmise that seeing somebody crazy on stage is one thing, but seeing them crazy face to face in an alley behind a theater in the middle of nowhere is kind of, so we didn't do that. But Ted Nugent, he's he's very smart, a sharp guy, whether you agree with his views or not. He's been a favorite on the talk show circuit because he's so focused. He can tell a story, he can speak to point. I've interviewed him. I actually interviewed him for WBCN, and people always say to me, "Well, what was the the hardest interviews you've ever done?" And I can remember some of those, although I don't like to recall them because they were painful. What are the easiest ones? And the easiest interviews are when somebody actually wants to answer your question and they're into it. It's the guys that answer you with one-word answers. That So what inspired you on this new album? That song, that opening song, yada yada, was just tremendous. Oh, I got up one morning and smoked some weed and drank some milk and coffee, and it just came out. So what about the guys in the band? It's the same guys as last album. I interviewed Bob Weir once like that. I'm certain he was on acid. I'm certain because I was asking him hey, great show tonight. He'd go, vanilla? The guys on stage are really clicking tonight, especially that guy from Rat Dog. Starburst. I mean, he was answering those things. It was one-word answers that made nothing, no sense. So it was like, those are terrifying interviews. But Ted Nugent is the complete opposite. Ted Nugent, so remember the band Damn Yankees? Okay, they were big. They did 2 albums beginning of the 90s. It was Ted Nugent, and it was Tommy Shaw from Styx, and I think Jack Blades from Night Ranger. Am I right? Anyways, there's a Night Ranger guy in it. And anyway, so they had a platinum album, and they were playing Great Woods. You know, they could sell out Great Woods. So we want to interview, BCN wants to interview Ted Nugent, and the record label wants us to interview him so we can plug the album. So they say, well, just be backstage to interview Ted. And we had a microphone set up in this laundry room, believe it, behind the stage. When we used to do interviews at Great Woods, the microphone was in the laundry room. And I remember interviewing Pete Townsend back there, and you could hear the dryer going. And some band had thrown, one guy in a band had thrown his sneakers in there. And you're just like, so tell me more about Quadrophenia. Boom, 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 yeah. But anyway, we got this brand new wireless microphone. It was great because we were no longer tethered to the laundry room with the dryer from hell. And so they said, well, Ted's going to come out just before the show, just be in the side of the stage. And you can talk to him until he has to go on stage. I go, okay. So I'm out there with the wireless and waiting. You know, I got my headphones on. I'm listening to the radio station. I see Ted Nugent coming around the back. He's by the drum kit. I don't know, maybe Tammy Heidi was on the air. I go, Tammy, Ted Nugent's coming around. Maybe you should like send it to me. So she sends it down to me, and I start talking. I go, and look, here comes Ted Nugent. Ted Nugent, come around. Hey, come on over here, Ted. Hey, how you doing? Yeah. I go, so Ted, what's going on? And that's the last thing I had to say. He goes, well, Carter, we got this band, damn Yankees. You know, we got Jack Blade, we got these guys. Tommy Shaw, man, he's smoking on the guitar. Blah, blah. 10 minutes. Didn't stop. I couldn't have interrupted him if I wanted to, but that's okay. Made my job easy. And all of a sudden, there was a couple of explosions on stage. Gotta go. Boom. Ted Nugent on ZLX, on BCN. So, you know, so Ted's been, and the last time I saw him, he was like, he had some stage outfit. He was firing arrows into Saddam Hussein's face. It was something, you know, that was, you know, that's Ted. Anybody see Ted Nugent? Yeah?
Yeah, I saw him open for Kiss in, I think it was 2000.
Yeah, okay, down at Great Woods?
Yeah.
I remember that, yeah. Yeah, Kiss was great. Yeah. Carrie, my wife, loves Kiss. We went to see Kiss and Aerosmith, and we had really good seats. We were like 10th row back, and every time like a flash bomb went off or an explosive device, she would scream. And you know, when you go to a Kiss show, it's like there's an explosive device like every 20 seconds. You know, it's like, ah! Ah! Oh, these guys, it's funny. That's okay. That's good. All right, I got a Cars story and a Rolling Stones story. Maybe I'll do the Cars story first because we're talking about Aerosmith, and the Cars story is local. So this is chapter 17, and this is at the Rathskeller, and it's September 9th, 1977. And it starts off with a little scene in the street, and then I kind of condensed it. I talk about the rat, and then we come back to the scene in the street. Crosstown traffic. Hey, you guys suck over there. Punk rock is for losers. The group of portentously drunk, apparently former wrestlers, hung on to each other, laughing and pitching about on the sidewalk in front of the disco club. They gestured rudely across Kenmore Square towards a few of us as we talked, our leather jackets insulating us from the coolness of an early September night just after last call. Did you hear me? One of them taunted. His powder blue leisure suit filled ominously with muscles as big as his vocal cords. I said, you guys suck! His buddies howled, then began stumbling away while we profoundly ignored the outburst. Punk rock chicks are all sluts, he conjured up. They'll do any of us over here for a quarter. Again, we let it go by. But one stunner in a leather skirt, blue jean jacket, and the stereotype safety pin dangling as her earring did respond with a hearty, eat shit. Well, that was it. The group stopped in its tracks while Mr. Powder Blue feigned total outrage. Did you hear that? He shouted. His mates rejoined him, weaving slightly as they moved to cross the street. A rallying yell, "We're gonna kick your," was abruptly cut short as a hurtling cab blared its horn and nearly sent the wrestling squad flying into some suburban cemetery. Perhaps Stoughton, Billerica, or whatever woodland town they were from slept soundly at 2 a.m., but Kenmore Square in Boston still throbbed with activity. With two wide streets to cross and an MBTA bus station in the middle, It would take the drunks a little while and some determination to get to us, but the disco boys seemed bent on clobbering time, so still they came on. This time around, though, they looked both ways before stepping off the curb. We were standing on the sidewalk in front of Boston's preeminent punk rock club. The sign out in front might have said Rathskeller, but to those who practically lived there, it was always the Rat. Sure, the punk club did exist in a cellar like a German beer hall might, but after that, most similarities ended. One descended down a dark stairway into a room framed between a cement floor cushioned by a bed of rotting cigarette butts and a low ceiling crisscrossed by turn of the last century plumbing caked in layers of ancient dust. I wagered that the footprints of many members of species Rattus norvicus could be seen dotting those pipes. Express lanes for the alarmingly large critters often seen scurrying from wall to wall. That's why it was always a good idea not to look up at the Rat. Occasionally, when a lead singer reached above to hang on to the large diameter pipe passing right over stage, you had to hope that he was current on all of his required immunizations. Black paint on the walls, black paint on the ceiling, goes with everything, you know. The space was truly a lobby into Hades. But you didn't go to the Rat for the decor. This place served as a prime meeting point for the whole local scene, while the new do-it-yourself bands of a now generation worked it out on a plywood square barely higher than the floor. The best place to watch a show at the Rat was right in front of either speaker cabinet flanking the stage. It was loud there, but if you stuck a finger in your ear closest to the noise, you could handle it. From this prime vantage point that few reasonable people ever fought for, I watched the Boston band that all my really cool friends couldn't say enough about. The Cars were an up-and-coming local group that seemed to have a jet engine attached to its back. The group launched into a set of songs that would eventually fill a million-selling debut album with stories of cars, girls, rock and roll, and did I say girls? Even with its first album 10 months away, I still felt that I was listening to a band play a set from its greatest hits record. No duds, just hard-driving ear candy. The group cruised on a tradition trafficked from Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, and Eddie Cochran, shaking hands with a celestial future dropped off by Brian Eno, Kraftwerk, or maybe a visiting UFO. Perhaps that's why the band became so popular. As it bridged the gap between the 70s and 80s, it also crossed the border between the fringes and the mainstream. The Cars would be one-hit album that die-hard punks always allowed onto their turntables, while pop music fans could risk a drive into punk territory for its catchy yet edgy songs. Of course, neither camp knew anything about that future agreement. At the moment, they were as divided as the two sides of Kenmore Square. The buffoons were still trying to cross the street to kick our asses. Really? They couldn't know it, but the band I had just seen would probably be a regular part of their mental playlist in less than a year. But even if we were future comrades in Cars, right now the lives, or at least the faces, of the punk rockers loitering on the chewing gum splattered concrete were in immediate danger. Careening traffic kept the invaders at bay for the moment, pumping fists and shouting, demonstrating resolve as they waited in frustration for the parade of cars and taxis to diminish. Finally, the flow eased, and the ragged bunch ran across to the bus station, climbing a low wall to reach a surging wave of automobiles heading the opposite direction on the other side. "Screw you, we're going to mess you up," the ringleader shouted. But most of his buddies had already become weary of their mission. With the endless supply of honking vehicles darting by and drivers yelling for the fools to get out of the road, the group turned around and began walking back, one of them calming down Powder Blue and pulling him along. The posse made it back to disco territory alive, and after one last glare back at us, disappeared up Beacon Street. Who knows, maybe I'd be sitting next to one of them at a car show in the Boston Garden in a year or two. Hopefully, though, neither of us would be wearing anything close to that blue polyester thing. Cigars. Yeah, the Cars, the Rat was great. You know, I loved being involved in the punk scene. I mean, the punk was a lot different here in America than it was in England. I mean, if you were an English punk, you were demonstrating in the streets and throwing bricks through windows and calling for the Queen to, die like Johnny Rotten did. But here in America, it was more of a musical thing. It was an attempt to wake up the music scene and do a whole new style of music, And so it was a lot of fun. And I just moved to Boston from New Hampshire, and this is my first time living in a big city, because I lived in Boston for 13 years in the middle of town. And so the punk scene was great because you would see the same people at the show. And you talk about the punks were at the Rat. We were all like, either had graduated from college or had been kicked out of college. A lot of the bands were, Berkeley College rejects, or they left. Elliot Easton from the Cars he studied at Berkeley. So it was just a really cool scene. And it led to, the new wave scene and a great inrush of bands, the MTV era. The Boston local scene, I don't think has ever been any better. Between 1978 and 1986, 87. Certainly there were great bands after that. But you could count on going to any number of clubs and seeing some great music in Boston. And those bands were getting signed by major labels because they were being heard and getting a chance to get better as they kept playing at that club night after night. So, I missed that scene, but it was a good time. Did anybody ever hang out at the Rat? Anybody? Yeah. You hung out and you survived.
I did.
I
can talk about it.
You can talk about it. Yeah, that place is now, it's the Hotel Commonwealth. And there's a McDonald's right there,
Yes.
which is kind of depressing. Yeah. There's a postscript for the punk scene. There's a McDonald's at the most important punk club in Boston.
What year did you say that was, the Cars were at the Rat?
What's that?
What year did you say?
That was 1977. That was before the first album came out.
Because I saw them in Philadelphia at the Spectrum. They opened for Foreigner.
Yeah?
I can remember liking them better than Foreigner. That was my first concert. It was 77 or 78.
That was your first show. That's cool. I saw some shows at the Spectrum too. They worked hard like any band. And their first show was in 76 up in New Hampshire at Peace Air Force Base. They played up there. That was their first show. So 76 to 77, they were playing the local scene and they probably didn't play that gig until that first album was out. I'm not sure.
I recognized the music.
Right.
They were the opening act. And
Right.
was the headliner.
That's cool. That's why it's always good to get there in time to see the opening band. Sometimes they're great. Bob Seger played last week, and Nancy Wilson from Heart was debuting her solo band, and I was saying, wow, nobody's seen this band. You should make sure you get there early, because then you get turned on to bands that blow you away. I remember going to see, when I was really young, I went to see Kansas, and a band we never heard of called Rush was warming up. And my buddy and I were like, who are these guys? I don't know, 3 guys. Whoa, who are these guys? Wow. It's like, and so we became Rush freaks, just because they were so good. So, and back in the day, there really wasn't the apparatus available to promote bands. Nowadays, if you're a pretty savvy local band with a good handle on the internet and Facebook and all that, you can promote yourself pretty well. Back then, it was you got an article in a magazine like Rolling Stone every couple of weeks, or Circus magazine every month, or you got on one of the local FM stations, and the stations weren't really interconnected. So like what the guy was doing in Chicago, maybe nobody knew about. Bands that we loved up here, like Aerosmith, didn't break out of New England for years, So it was, it was tough back then. You had to you take it in your own hands. You had to be a rock and roll soldier to get out there in the trenches. Yeah.
And you must know this better than anybody, but how do you feel when you found this great new band and you're trying to tell people about them, and you know that a year from now they're going to say, I should have listened, but they don't?
Right.
And you feel frustrated, you feel vindicated when it happens?
No, it's excellent, because then you say, I told you so, I told you so, ha ha ha.
Maybe after the senior at UMass, to a new band come and play the Student Union Ballroom, a couple hundred people, I scored a pair of tickets and had to drag somebody after half of the people said no, and it was Pearl Jam.
Nice, nice.
And now they're kicking themselves.
Well, that happened to me. Friends told me I should go see Nirvana. I'm like, yeah, I'll get to it. Well, they only played a couple of times, and then I finally went to see him out at the Wallace Civic Center out in Fitchburg. And by that time, there was so much hype. It was like, how could a band be that good? You know, Kurt Cobain, his problems were very public. How can they play well? And they were amazing. It was like seeing The Who. They were that tight. I was like, wow, wow. And there was a guy that I was going to take. I asked people, I had an extra ticket. This is in '93. It's in the book. I asked people, I says, anybody want to go to see Nirvana with me? Nobody wanted to go. Nobody could go. And so finally, I actually worked out in the gym down the street, the Body Shop. You know, there used to be a gym down the street that we worked at back in the 90s. And there was a guy that worked the front door named Spike. His hair, you know, hit a mohawk. And one night I'm like, hey, Spike, you want to go see Nirvana? I don't want to go out to Fitchburg by myself. He's like, yeah, but I need the money, man. I'm going to work. Okay. So I went by myself. And then I gave my ticket to the first kid I saw in the parking lot that looked like he wasn't going to turn around and sell it. And the show was great. And then 6 months later, you know, Kurt Cobain commits suicide. And like now, every time I see Spike, which is not too often, but every time, I should have went that night. I should have went that night. So, you know, you never know when you're going to see the next genius. You never know. I mean, and that's kind of fun because we've all been taken to shows by a friend, I think, that, you know, we weren't going to go, but they went, no, come on, I want someone to go with, or you're going to love this band. And, you know, then you end up going, wow, they were right. And then you end up doing the same thing for other people. So, you know, I remember seeing U2 at the very beginning and didn't need to convince too many people because the music got on the radio very quickly and people liked it. So they kind of blew up pretty fast. But, you know, it was great to take people to see U2 because they were always good. You know, even if there was a weird situation, they seemed to rise above. And so I would take people to see U2 and they'd be like, this band's great. You know, and they'd take other people, you know, so I told you so. All right, I should read this Rolling Stones show because I have a friend in the back who's a Rolling Stones freak. Sharon, yes. And this goes back to the early years. This is from the Spectrum in Philadelphia. This is when I was still living at home, although I was in college and I would come home for summer. This is the best stuff in town. The Rolling Stones, Spectrum, Philadelphia, June 30th, 1975. You can hear me okay in the back, right? Yes. Awesome. Okay. I started seeing a lot of groups in concert, but the Rolling Stones always existed on a level above, wielding the maturity and legendary status of being one that had actually helped forge the music that so many now emulated in the 70s. The band, however, didn't tour America that often. As established international superstars, the group's presence was coveted all around the globe. Then the Rolling Stones announced a major summer visit. The Tour of Americas 75 would commence the 1st of June with 2 shows in Baton Rouge and wrap up August 8th in Buffalo. At that moment, I was in New Hampshire at New England College, although it might as well have been on the moon, since by the time I heard about it, the Rolling Stones sellouts were ancient history. So much for that. I submerged into my preparations for final exams and promptly forgot about seeing the gods of rock and roll. After the semester, I stayed up north rather than return to my native Pennsylvania, and life in New Hampshire settled into a lazy cycle of work, party, and sleep. With the Rolling Stones tour completely off my radar, I have to say that when Jeb, one of my college buddies, approached me one day and let it slip the almost unfathomable truth that his dad had scored tickets to one of the Spectrum concerts, I was astounded. Your dad? I blurted doubtfully. Jeb was from the Philadelphia area, and he explained about some connection his father had to someone somewhere down there. But the stunning revelation remained. There were 4 tickets up for grabs. You in? He asked. Hell yeah. When is it? Monday. It was Friday. Almost no time to figure out a way to skip work, but I do it. When you're 20, you'll do something crazy like drive 6 hours straight, then go right into the concert, which is what we did. At the arena, we could have easily cashed out our seats at great profit to any of the thousands of the unticketed desperately milling about. Fat chance, it was the Rolling Stones. Our seats were high off the floor of the balcony, though, with only a few rows between them and the ceiling. You've been there. You've been there. Jeb was not positive. Heck with this. I don't even want to go up there. Let's get closer. Heading back down, we actually managed to infiltrate the first section of the loge without being detained. But we had to keep angling downwards towards the floor since there were no empty seats to disappear into. You've all done that. You know, hey, it's empty seats, slide in, you get thrown out, other seats, you know. But it didn't. But it wasn't working for us that night. Looking from the aisle, I could see the Stones' much ballyhooed, custom-designed six-pointed stage directly below and to the right of us. The roadies who had been rushing all over it just a few moments earlier were now waiting at their duty stations. Showtime was imminent. We continued down the steps leading onto the floor, but our path was resolutely blocked by a man genetically designed for his job. In a walkway that allowed two people to slip past one another, this behemoth's shoulders dominated the entire width, with beefy arms walling off the flanks. We were staring at a real-life version of a Rock'em Sock'em robot, who gazed back with an immobile plastic scowl. The giant didn't even talk, just held out a hand for our tickets, which confirmed for him that we were just two more losers off course. Waving a flashlight irritatingly up the aisle, he was about to inform us of what we all knew when the arena turned pitch black. Talk about timing. Pandemonium. People boiled down the stairs behind us, thrusting towards the robot barricade, who decided he didn't get paid enough to be trampled and stepped aside. The cascading bodies propelled us into another stream of figures racing up the right aisle of the floor, hurtling forward with whitewater fury. In seconds, we were swept up and deposited directly against a security barrier between the front row of seats and the right apex of the stage. We were as close as you could get. Unbelievable. But would we quickly be rooted out and sent packing back to the nosebleeds? It sure didn't seem so. People swiftly packed in around us in an impenetrable mass, and security backed off to concentrate its forces behind the barrier between the audience and the band. We were here to stay. Smoke generators clouded the space as a massive overhead lighting rig burned slowly into brilliance, revealing the group standing in a green, spooky haze. The lights blazed hotter and details swam into view. Mick Jagger in light, loose-fitting pants and shirt began to jerk with his inimitable dance as Charlie Watts snapped into the rock-steady rhythm of honky-tonk women. Keith Richards appeared in stoned majesty, leather pants and t-shirt, his simple rock and roll uniform, while brand new stoned Ronnie Wood, with rooster hair and the first of many cigarettes glued to his lips, snapped into sync alongside. Meanwhile, right in front of our section, on the stage, stood the nearly immobile bassist Bill Wyman, who gazed back at the hysterical audience with all the emotion of one staring at a bologna sandwich. That's part of the Stone story. But that's, that's what it was. I mean, the Stones, seeing the Stones is like, they were the band that everybody looked to. So if you see a band like that, it's like, wow, that's why a Stone, and they can still play. Of course, after this show, I didn't see them for a few years. I saw them in '81 in Philadelphia at JFK Stadium, where Live Aid was. And then there was this 8-year period where they didn't play because Mick and Keith were having a spat. They didn't play for 8 years. And when they came back, they did the Steel Wheels Tour in 1989. They played 3 nights in Foxborough. And some of you were probably there. And I'm going to bring my wife into this again. She had never seen the Stones. And she made a comment like, it wasn't really a cut. It was like, well, Stones. And it was like, and I was saying, well, this is definitely going to be the last time they tour. So you got to see them before they give up. 1989, they're pretty long in the tooth. But I also said, she loves dancing. I said, you have got to see Mick Jagger dance. I said, you may not like you may not like Keith Richards. He's like the engine room of the band, and you might not know all the songs, but you got to see Mick Jagger dance. So BCA, we were doing all 3 shows, so we were down there all 3 nights. We were there really early, and one of the benefits sometimes is that they'll give us a good ticket. And we had really good seats. We were like 25 rows down front, right in the middle. Perfect. At Foxborough Stadium. you know, with the aluminum seats. Ouch. And so as soon as the show starts, Mick starts moving, and he doesn't stop for the whole show. I mean, it's just like this, you know, and he does all these spooky, weird things like, you know, it's like, what is he doing? But it works. I mean, it only works when I do it because you're thinking of him. And she was amazed, you know, and every time they've come back, because it's going to be the last tour, we've gone to see him again, and just unbelievable. That, you know, that mesh of personalities, plus the fact that Keith Richards and Mick were, you know, a hit-making machine. Those guys have written so many songs, my God. So seeing the Stones is always a thrill, although of late it's become a bit of an expensive thing, going to see them. Sorry. You know, you can buy the really expensive tickets to see the Stones, and you can meet them backstage, but you have to mortgage your house. And actually, what they do is, when they're in a stadium, they set up tents backstage, all these tents. And when they're playing a place like the Garden, it'll be meeting rooms, locker rooms. And one room is for like the record company guys, you know, the guys in the business. They come in to meet the guys from the record company. And then they come into the room where if you bought the $1,000 ticket, you get to meet the band. That's your room. And then they come in and meet the radio knuckleheads in the third room. That's us. And, you know, retail people, that sort of thing. And it's really wild because we're always the third room. And you can hear it starting to happen. You hear this down the hall, you hear this, ah! And then about a couple minutes later, it gets closer. Ah! And all of a sudden, the Stones appear in the doorway and they just come into the room. Like, they don't just like stand in the room like, they like come in the room like this. It's awesome, you know? And Keith Richards always goes for the first blonde he sees, which is my wife. Twice now. Yeah. Well, the funniest one was like, and so, what are you going to say to Mick Jagger that he hasn't heard? You know, what am I going to tell Mick Jagger? So Mick, you know, we got involved in a deep conversation. It's not going to really happen. It's, you know, he's met everybody, and I think they know that. So they only stay in the room for 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And so you get to say hi to Mick Jagger, shake his hand, but you're not required to come out with anything intelligent. You don't have to, and it's kind of a load is off, you know. And they get around, they meet everybody, and all of a sudden, the English photographer traveling with the tour, everybody, look this way, look this way. Photographer takes 2 pictures, and he disappears. And that's great. Yeah, I mean, that's all you really need. You got a picture with the band, and the one time, you know, Keith was with my wife, and Mick was in front of Keith, and the guy was trying to take the picture, and Keith was like, "What are you doing, man? Get out of the way!" And they're doing that little pissy thing, you know? Get out of the way. You know, anyway, so that's the Stones. Maybe too much about the Stones. All right. What should I read? I got a Pearl Jam story. I got a short Springsteen story. You know what? Joe Perry. We were talking about Aerosmith. This one's called The Cheap. Are we okay on time? Am I? Yeah, I'm okay? All right. He'll come up with a ruler and start wrapping my hands. This happens in a library. Joe Perry with Cheap Trick. Now, Joe Perry had a birthday party back in 2000. He turned 50. And back then, the band owned a restaurant in Norwell called Mount Blue. So this occurs at Mount Blue. Joe Perry, his birthday party, and it's called a Cheap Golden Jubilee. Let me just drink a little water before I lose my voice. I can't drink too much water before, or else I'd have to excuse myself too often. Long before his 50th birthday, Joe Perry had come to terms with the drugs and the downward spiral. He turned away towards the light of his wife, Billy, his family, and making great music. Perry had survived many storms, and he had a lot to be thankful for, so his 50th would be no trifling commemoration. If you were Joe Perry, you'd merit a birthday party to wow even yourself. Why not ask your favorite band to play? And who would say no to that request? Why not throw the bash in your own restaurant south of Boston? Heck, you already paid taxes on the joint. Why not use it? Then perhaps you could invite a couple hundred friends to the shindig, a small enough gathering so you could recognize everyone there, and hip enough to create an event destined to spark local hysteria. Billy, with the help of some Aerosmith staffers, got to work organizing the whole affair. Once contacted, the members of Joe's beloved Cheap Trick elatedly agreed to perform, then extended the guest of honor the privilege of handpicking their set list. A night was set aside at Mount Blue, the establishment in Norwell that Joe and Steven Tyler were part owners of. I duly noted the date, put it in my calendar, and went about my daily business, while my wife obsessed for weeks about what to wear. Cheap Trick took stage in front of undoubtedly its smallest audience since its earliest days of the band. But the musicians tore into their first set with the same fury and passion they delivered at the Boston Garden in front of thousands. Clearly, they were inspired to bring their A game by Joe Perry, a guitarist who, in no small part, had informed the group's very existence. Perry had decided to enjoy his birthday gift to the fullest by playing the entire second set, which began with guns blazing on Hello There. Steven Tyler appeared at the main mic for a smoking version of the Beatles' tribute to Little Richard, I'm Down. And aside from the partially planned musical chairs going on, Joe had anticipated most everything happening on stage so far, but he never suspected what was coming. After another sweaty Beatles track, Day Tripper, a guitar tech walked out and placed an additional instrument on stage. Years earlier, when the guitarist had been going through hard times, desperate for cash, he'd sold off a prized Les Paul 59 tobacco burst Gibson that had sounded out the immortal guitar riffs on Rocks and Draw the Line. He'd wanted to buy that guitar back for years, finally tracing it through a few owners to Slash from Guns N' Roses, an unabashed Joe Perry freak, who wasn't about to part with one of his hero's own original axes, even for many thousands of dollars. But there it was. The real McCoy rested on its stand next to him like the prodigal son returned to father. There was no price tag. This was a gift from Slash, the perfect gift. Joe Perry was a pretty guarded, cool-hand Luke kind of guy. The Fonz had nothing on him. But you never saw any eyes grow bigger than on the guitarist at that moment. Years in the making, the surprise was absolute. Perhaps even a tear started to form on that legend's face, but we'd never know it as the pair were reunited in Joe's hands and they honeymooned off together into the old Rolling Stones hit, It's All Over Now. And that song choice seemed quite appropriate. Joe's past 50 years were done, and the quest for that guitar had ended. And by the way, at last check, both guitar player and guitar were living happily ever after. Yeah. I heard one of Joe's roadies actually offered Slash $50,000 for that guitar, and that was early on. Probably became even worth more. All right. All right.